mindaddig napirenden marad, amíg mindenhol be nem látják, hogy a migráció a terrorizmus trójai falova.
In the space of just half a year, the number of immigrants has dropped sharply. Not across Europe, but in Hungary. While many of the Western powerhouses of Europe are struggling to contain the situation, Hungary has somehow already solved it. Hungary had to go against the grain with their immigration policy. The bigger nations of the EU had a leftist pro-immigration stance, but the right-wing Hungarian government was going to ruffle a few feathers to achieve their goals. So the means they took to get there are not something the rest of Europe would want to emulate. But how did Hungary fix the immigration crisis? The answer to that lies with the most powerful man in the whole of Hungary. Viktor Orbán has always held conservative right-wing views for a very long time. Back in 2015, he made it clear that he didn't want to see a day where Hungary loses its cultural homogeny because there were too many foreigners in the country. Plenty of right-wing politicians in Europe would jump at the chance to call anti-immigration laws tyranny, but if immigration is good or not really just depends on who you ask. Because immigration is something that every country in Europe is facing, Western countries like France and the UK deal with as many immigrants as Eastern nations such as Russia and Hungary. But despite the entire continent dealing with it, their viewpoints are not always similar. For example, the UK is more welcoming to immigrants from all over the world as compared to its eastern neighbors such as Belarus, the Czech Republic, and so on. This is reflected in the immigrant population in the year 2023. As many as 1.2 million immigrants entered the United Kingdom. This was as many immigrants arrived in the span of 3 years between 2014 to 2016, hinting at an increase in the immigration rate in the UK. In Hungary, the number of immigrants entering its borders has never exceeded 250,000 in a year for any of the last 10 years. Aside from the drastic different immigration rates the different regions of Europe have, their ideologies are also very contrasting. The closest Hungary got to ever having a liberal government was back in 2009, when Ferenc Gyurcsány was Prime Minister of the country, although he was a member of the Hungarian Socialist Party, which formed a coalition with the left-wing party, Alliance of Free Democrats. This was the most liberal the Hungarian government had ever been in recent years, but yet it wasn't the type of liberal that is common in the western part of the world. Ever since his resignation and Viktor Orbán's return to the helm of government, Hungary has gone back to its rather conservative state. But this is a norm for this part of Europe. Viktor Orbán has been in power for over a decade now, and he doesn't seem to show any signs of leaving anytime soon. Some of the most right-wing governments in Europe fall east of Germany. Our history doesn't have the best track record of democracy and capitalism, two of the biggest things the far left feeds on. As a result, immigration is not a big part of our history as compared to countries like France and the UK. You would imagine that given how far east Hungary is, it would be a hub for cultural exchange and all. But our history shows that anytime creeds meet, it's a clash. Hungary's strategic location made it a target for invaders, most notably the Mongols in the 13th century and the Ottoman Turks in the 16th century. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 marked the beginning of the Ottoman Empire's expansion into Europe, and Hungary found itself on the front lines of this Islamic conquest. In 1526, the Battle of Mohacs resulted in a crushing defeat for Hungary, leading to the partitioning of the kingdom. The central and southern parts of Hungary fell under Ottoman control, while the north and west became part of the Habsburg monarchy, and Transylvania operated as a semi-independent state under Ottoman suzerainty. The Ottoman occupation of Hungary lasted for over 150 years, a period marked by continuous warfare, depopulation, and economic decline. The struggle between Christianity and Islam was not just a clash of religions, but also a battle for the soul of Europe. Hungary as the battleground became a symbol of Christian resistance. The fall of Buda in 1541 solidified Ottoman control, but the siege of Vienna in 1683 marked the beginning of the end for Ottoman ambitions in Central Europe. The Great Turkish War saw Habsburg, with the support of European allies, gradually push the Ottomans out of Hungary, culminating in the Treaty of Karlovitz in 1699, which restored most of Hungary to Habsburg control. The Habsburg era in Hungary was a time of reconstruction and re-Christianization. Churches and monasteries were rebuilt, and Catholicism was reinforced as the dominant faith. However, this period also sowed the seeds of discontent, as the Hungarian nobility chafed under the Habsburg centralization and absolutism. The 18th and 19th centuries were characterized by a growing national consciousness and the desire for independence. Throughout these centuries, Hungary remained a predominantly Christian nation, and this religious identity became even more pronounced as it faced various external threats. This deep connection to Christianity influenced Hungary's social and cultural fabric, and it became a cornerstone of Hungarian nationalism. Even during the 20th century, when industrialization was happening throughout Europe, Eastern Europeans never relied on foreigners to build the country. So if we weren't kept on immigration then, why would we be keen on it now? Hungary's history is a complex narrative of resilience and resistance. From the fall of the Ottoman Empire to its modern-day policies, the country has consistently prioritized the protection of its Christian heritage and national identity. However, times have changed. People are migrating not just for a better life, but essentially for survival. Within the last decade, fighting in the Middle Eastern countries like Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan has led to an increase in refugees from these nations. And with nowhere to go, they migrate north into Europe. And as you can imagine, not all European nations are affected equally, with Southern Union members like Greece, Italy, Malta, and even Hungary having to deal with the burden more than more northern countries like Sweden and Norway. Most high-ranking EU leaders share the sentiment that it is their duty to offer shelter to the millions of refugees that enter Europe. Leaders which include Angela Merkel, Pedro Sanchez, and even Emmanuel Macron, despite having moderations about it. But the great irony about it is that we are all witnessing is that the liberty of some European leaders has caused their nations to perhaps welcome more people than they can accommodate. It has made conservative EU leaders have an "I told you so" smirk on their faces. I mean, it's only human to want to help, but trying to help beyond our capacity is damaging to even the person you're offering help to. I honestly feel for the millions of refugees that have had to flee their country. It's truly sad, and no human should have to face such a reality, but tragedy happens. As conservative of a nation as Hungary is, it initially was one of the nations receiving the most immigrants in Europe at a point. In 2015, for every 10,000 Hungarians, there were 43 immigrants entering the country, and the few asylum seekers it processed were because the EU mandated it. One of the reasons there were so many migrants in Hungary more than anywhere else was because it was a passage for immigrants to get to more friendlier places like Austria and Germany. But when other countries became stringent in their border policies, Hungary had to either adapt or absorb the migrants coming in. And you can guess what Viktor Orbán decided to do. He wasn't about to deal with other countries' incompetence in documenting and hosting migrants, so he started to put a few anti-immigrant policies in place. One of the things Orbán did was have fences built along Hungary's southern border with Croatia and Serbia. This had immigration fluctuating up and down across different seasons of the year, but by the time the fences were complete, it looked like the number of asylum seekers entering Hungary had reduced. As much as Hungary had put in place measures and procedures to legally enter the country, it wasn't any good because the rejection rate of asylum applications were the highest in the EU. In 2014, the roughly 39,000 applications that were rejected accounted for 91% of all applications. In 2015, that number dropped to 85%, but by 2017, only about 1% of asylum applications were accepted, despite the number of applications that year being 10 times less than the applications 3 years earlier. And if that wasn't enough, in June of 2018, Stop Soros laws were also put in place, which made it a criminal offense to offer legal aid and provide support for undocumented migrants. This meant that NGOs couldn't intervene in bettering the lives of refugees in Hungary. The message that the Hungarian government was trying to send to the world was that they simply couldn't take care of all these immigrants. I get why people are upset about what the Hungarian government is doing, but If we can take a step back to look at the bigger picture, maybe it might make a bit more sense. If Hungary had as many asylum seekers as Germany had, that would mean for every 10 people living in Hungary, one of them was a foreign national. Although the EU may never ask of that much from Hungary with the immigration quotas for its member states, Hungary is a very homogeneous nation. Over 80% of us are ethnic Hungarians. The biggest minority in the country are gypsies, who don't even make up to 15% of the population. Other minorities include ethnic Germans and people who originate from the Balkan states. Even the few who are not like us aren't really far from us. When it comes to religion, our small diversity beliefs make our ethnic composition look like a suburb in New York. Christianity is the main faith here, with different denominations including Roman Catholic, Calvinist, and so on, although Islam is practiced by less than 1% of the population. When you look at the demographic of immigrants, it's very contrasting, given the facts that the majority of the immigrants are Muslims from countries like Iraq, Syria, and so on. It makes the average Hungarian skeptical about things. Having to cater for people is one thing, but having to cater for so many people who speak a different language and are of a different creed. Mosques would have to be built. The language barrier would have to be bridged somehow. New yearly celebrations that were not part of Hungary's national calendar? These are just some of the changes I could think of from the top of my head. Hungary isn't one of the most diverse countries in Europe, and it is for this reason that it makes it so easy for politicians to push for an ideology to reach a consensus within the general public. Nationalism is a very strong theme in my country. What can I say? Hungarians are very enthusiastic about patriotism, and to be fair, it would be strange to ask an immigrant to share the same love and pride you have for your country and its history when there is another place that it's not here more dear to them. During the last elections, given how polarizing the whole immigration issue is, Viktor Orbán has used it to paint him and his party as the White Knights of Hungary, who are out to defend the nation's sovereignty. His anti-immigration laws have been met with support from the public, despite the international community frowning at it. Given how dogmatic he is on his stance about immigration, he has even been labeled as a racist, with ideals built on prejudice. These are claims that he denies, stating that he's just putting the interest of his nation above anything. As of last year, migrants made up 15% of the labor force in the United Kingdom and the Netherlands. In France, it was 12%. In Germany, that number was as high as 20%. And it's no surprise that these economies are doing well. The lack of moderation in Hungary's handling of the immigration issue isn't allowing them to make the most of the situation. The fear of a new demographic emerging and taking root in Hungary is what the government has clung to and used as an excuse to make sure that immigration is halted in the country. And as it stands, this looks like it's going to be the status quo in Hungary for a very long time. Because before things change, the majority of people need to be convinced that the far right aren't handling things the best way. Strong left-wing leaders need to be convincing enough to win seats in the parliament before they can even think of removing Orbán from the helm of government. But for now, if denying refugees asylum is how Hungary has solved its immigration problem, then it's done so well that the citizens of Hungary only really truly hear about the European immigration issue on the news.